The morning frost clung to the window pane like ghostly fingers, and Samuel Hawthorne traced their patterns with a calloused thumb. Outside his cabin, the Montana mountains stood silent beneath their white shroud, indifferent to the man who had made himself their prisoner these past 3 years. He moved with practiced efficiency through the small space, every movement calculated to avoid the mirror hanging by the wash basin. The left side of his face bore the memory of that terrible night, skin pulled tight and mottled like melted wax. The corner of his mouth permanently twisted downward. The fire that had taken his lumber mill had taken more than his livelihood. It had stolen his place among decent folk. The cabin itself was a testament to his skill with wood and hammer. Built with his own hands after the fire, it perched on a rocky ledge halfway up Redemption Mountain, accessible only by a narrow trail that discouraged visitors. Cedar logs fitted so perfectly they needed no chinking, a stone chimney that drew true, and furniture carved during the long winter nights when sleep wouldn't come. Everything a man needed to live, and nothing more. Samuel filled his coffee pot from the water bucket, the familiar ritual bringing its small comfort. 3 years of mornings like this, quiet, solitary, safe from the stares and whispers. He'd learned to move like the mountain cats that sometimes prowled past his door, slipping into town only when necessity demanded, face hidden beneath the brim of his hat, conducting his business in the early hours when few souls stirred. The townsfolk of Redemption had their stories about him. He'd heard them all, carried on the wind like smoke from their chimneys. Some said he'd set the fire himself for insurance money, though anyone with sense knew Sam Hawthorne had never been that kind of man. Others whispered darker tales, that he'd made a deal with the devil, that the scars were a mark of divine punishment for some unspoken sin. The children were the most honest in their cruelty. The scarred man, they called him, running when they glimpsed his shadow, daring each other to venture up the mountain path until their courage failed. Their mothers would pull them close, hissing warnings about the monster who lived alone in the woods. If they only knew how he'd gotten those scars. Samuel poured his coffee, black and bitter as his thoughts, and stepped out onto the narrow porch he'd built facing east. The sunrise painted the snow-covered valley below in shades of rose and gold, a daily masterpiece viewed by an audience of one. Sometimes he wondered if beauty still existed if there was no one to share it with. The memory came unbidden, as it often did in these quiet moments. The screams from the boarding house next to his mill, flames already licking at the walls. He'd run toward the fire instead of away, had pulled 2 children and their grandmother from the smoke-filled rooms before the beam fell, before the world exploded in pain and heat and darkness. The children had lived, the grandmother too. They'd moved away soon after, couldn't bear to look at what their salvation had cost their savior. No one spoke of his heroism now. It was easier to fear a monster than to feel indebted to one. A hawk circled overhead, its cry piercing the mountain silence. Samuel watched it hunt, patient and solitary, and recognized a kindred spirit. Some creatures were meant to live alone, he'd decided. It was nature's way. His supplies were running low. Tomorrow he'd have to make the trek to town, endure the ritual of averted eyes and hurried transactions. Watson's general store opened at dawn. He could be in and out before the morning crowd gathered to gossip over their purchases. The sun climbed higher, and Samuel retreated inside. He had work to do, furniture to craft that he'd sell through Watson, who was one of the few men in town still willing to do business with him, though even Watson couldn't meet his eyes anymore. The pieces Samuel made were sought after for their quality, though buyers never knew whose hands had shaped the wood. Watson was careful about that, protecting his customers from the discomfort of owning something touched by the scarred man. At his workbench, Samuel picked up a piece of pine he'd been shaping into a child's toy, a little horse with wheels. He didn't know why he made such things. No child would ever play with them. Not knowingly. Perhaps it was his way of staying connected to a world that had cast him out, creating small pieces of joy even if he could never witness their reception. The knife moved smoothly through the soft wood. each stroke deliberate and sure. This was his meditation, his prayer, in the grain of the wood, in the emergence of form from formlessness. He found a peace that eluded him in sleep. His hands, at least, remained unmarked, still capable of creating beauty even if he could no longer embody it. As afternoon shadows grew long, Samuel set aside his work and prepared a simple meal: salt pork and beans, cornbread cooked in his cast-iron skillet, the same meal he'd eaten yesterday, and would eat tomorrow. Routine was a comfort when everything else had been stripped away. Later, as darkness settled over the mountain, he sat by his fire with one of the few books he owned, reading by lamplight. The words were familiar friends now, worn smooth by repetition. Sometimes he read aloud, just to hear a human voice, even if it was only his own, made strange by the damage to his face. The wind picked up outside, rattling the shutters he'd reinforced against winter storms. Another blizzard was coming. He could smell it in the air. Good. The storms kept people away, gave him an excuse to postpone his trip to town. He had enough coffee and flour to last another week if he was careful. Before bed, Samuel made his final check of the cabin. Fire banked in the hearth, door barred against the night and whatever might wander out of the wilderness. He paused at the wash basin, and for once met his own eyes in the mirror. The right side of his face was still that of the man he'd been, strong jaw, weathered skin of a man who'd worked honest labor all his life, but the left side belonged to a stranger, a creature from a child's nightmare. The contrast was perhaps the cruelest part. He was neither wholly monster nor wholly man, but something caught between. Tomorrow, he said to his reflection, the word distorted by his twisted mouth. It was the same promise he made every night. Tomorrow he might venture farther than the general store. Tomorrow he might speak to someone beyond the bare necessities of commerce. Tomorrow he might remember how to be human again. But tonight, like every night for 3 years, he blew out his lamp and climbed into his narrow bed alone. Outside, the wind howled through the pines, and somewhere in the valley below, the people of Redemption were gathering around their own fires, safe in the knowledge that the scarred man was keeping to his mountain, where monsters belonged. Samuel closed his eyes and waited for sleep, knowing it would bring dreams of fire and falling beams, of children's voices calling for help, of a life where his face didn't frighten those he'd tried to save. And in the morning, the frost would paint new patterns on his window, and another day of solitude would begin. The mountain had become his world, his refuge, his prison, and Samuel Hawthorne, the scarred man of Redemption Mountain, had almost convinced himself it was enough. The stagecoach from Denver had arrived in Redemption 2 days late, and Eleanor Whitfield stepped down into the dusty street with all the grace her aching bones could muster. The November wind cut through her traveling cloak, carrying the promise of early snow, and she shivered as she looked around the small frontier town that was to be her new home. She was 23 years old and had been blind for exactly 11 months. The fever had come sudden and fierce the previous winter, burning through her body like wildfire. When it finally broke, it left her in darkness. The doctors in Philadelphia had been baffled. Her eyes appeared unchanged, still the same clear blue that had once charmed suitors at society gatherings. But the world had vanished behind an impenetrable veil, leaving her trapped in eternal night. "Miss Whitfield?" A gruff voice spoke near her left shoulder, making her start. "I'm Jacob Turner, your uncle's man. He sent me to fetch you." Eleanor turned toward the voice, a habit she couldn't break, even though it made no difference now. "Mr. Turner, thank you for coming." She kept her voice steady, though her heart raced. Everything about this journey terrified her. The unfamiliar sounds, the strange smells, the constant fear of stumbling or worse. Turner didn't offer his arm, and Eleanor was too proud to ask. She heard him loading her trunk onto what sounded like a wagon, the horses stamping impatiently in the cold. Her fingers found the wooden side of the wagon bed, and she carefully felt her way to where she hoped a step might be. "It's a fair piece to your uncle's place," Turner said as she struggled to climb up gracefully. "Road gets rough once we leave town." Eleanor settled herself on the hard bench, pulling her cloak tighter. She'd heard little from Uncle Cornelius since her parents' death 5 years ago, and nothing at all since she'd lost her sight. It had been her brother-in-law, Charles, who'd written to him, explaining her condition and asking if he could take her in. The response had been brief, a grudging agreement and nothing more. Charles had made it abundantly clear that she was no longer welcome in his household. His wife, Eleanor's sister, Margaret, had been torn between family loyalty and her husband's demands. In the end, Charles had won. A blind woman was a burden, he'd said, speaking as if Eleanor wasn't sitting right there. Bad for the children to see their aunt so afflicted. Bad for business to have damaged goods in the family. The wagon lurched into motion, and Eleanor gripped the bench to keep from sliding. Around her, the sounds of the town faded, the blacksmith's hammer, the saloon's tinny piano, the voices of people going about their daily lives. Soon there was only the creak of wheels, the steady clop of hooves, and the vast silence of the frontier. "Your uncle's a hard man," Turner said after they'd traveled for what felt like hours. "Fair warning, miss, he weren't happy about taking you in." Eleanor had suspected as much. "I don't intend to be a burden, Mr. Turner. I can work, I can cook, clean, tend house." Turner's snort cut her off. "Begging your pardon, miss, but you can't even see the step up to a wagon. How you planning to tend house when you can't see what needs tending?" The words stung because they echoed her own fears. In Philadelphia, she'd had her family's house memorized, could navigate the familiar rooms with growing confidence. But here, everything would be foreign. Every step would be a potential disaster. "I'll learn," she said quietly. They traveled in silence after that. Eleanor tried to build a map in her mind from the sounds and sensations. They crossed what must have been a wooden bridge from the hollow echo beneath the wheels, passed through a forest where the wind sang differently through pine needles, climbed steadily upward as the horses' breathing grew labored. The temperature dropped as they climbed. Eleanor's fingers went numb despite her gloves, and she could feel snow beginning to fall. Cold kisses on her upturned face. The wind picked up, howling like a living thing, and the wagon began to sway alarmingly. "Storms coming in fast," Turner muttered. "Damn fool time to be traveling. Should have waited till spring to ship you out here." Eleanor bit back a response, as if she'd had any choice in the timing. Charles had wanted her gone before the holidays, before he had to explain her presence to his business associates at Christmas gatherings. The wagon lurched suddenly. Throwing Eleanor hard against the side rail, she heard Turner curse, felt the vehicle tilt at a dangerous angle. "Wheels stuck," he announced. "You'll have to get down while I free it." Eleanor felt her way to the edge of the wagon, her skirts tangling around her legs. The step down was higher than she'd expected, and she stumbled, falling to her knees in what felt like mud mixed with snow. Pain shot through her left ankle. "For the love of—" Turner's voice was heavy with disgust. "Can't even climb down from a wagon without making a mess of it." Tears stung Eleanor's eyes, but she blinked them back. She would not cry, not in front of this man who already saw her as nothing but a burden. She tried to stand, but her ankle buckled, sending her back to the ground. The wind howled louder, and she heard Turner working with the wheel, metal tools clanging, his cursing growing more creative. Snow fell heavier now, already beginning to accumulate on her shoulders and in her hair. She crawled toward where she thought the wagon must be, seeking any shelter from the storm. Time passed, minutes or hours. She couldn't tell. The cold seeped through her clothes, numbing her hands and feet. Turner's voice grew more distant, muffled by the wind and snow. Then she heard a sharp crack, like breaking wood, followed by Turner's scream. "Mr. Turner?" Eleanor called, struggling to her feet despite the pain in her ankle. "Mr. Turner, are you hurt?" No response came except the howling wind. Eleanor stumbled forward, hands outstretched, trying to find the wagon. Turner, anything. Her fingers met only empty air and driving snow. Panic rose in her throat. She was alone, blind, injured, in a blizzard in unfamiliar country. "Help!" she screamed into the wind. "Someone, please help!" But who would hear her? Turner had said they were miles from town, miles from her uncle's ranch. She didn't even know which direction to walk, assuming she could walk at all on her twisted ankle. She tried to retrace her steps to where she'd fallen, hoping to find the wagon, but in her blindness and panic, she'd lost all sense of direction. Each step might be taking her further from safety. The cold was a living thing now, biting through her wet clothes, making her limbs heavy and clumsy. Eleanor sank to her knees in the snow, finally allowing the tears to fall. They froze on her cheeks almost instantly. This was how it would end. Then, not in her bed surrounded by family, not peacefully in old age, but alone in a snowstorm. Just another burden that the world had decided to shed. She thought of her parents, dead from influenza 5 years past. Thought of Margaret, who'd wept when Charles announced Eleanor must go. Thought of the life she'd once planned. Marriage to a kind man. Children. A home filled with light and laughter. All of it lost to a fever that had stolen her sight and, with it, her future. The wind screamed around her, and Eleanor screamed back, pouring all her rage and fear and sorrow into the sound. She beat her fists against the ground until her knuckles were raw, cursing the fever, cursing Charles, cursing the God who had abandoned her to this fate. When her strength finally failed, she curled into herself, making her body as small as possible against the storm. The darkness behind her eyes was no different from the darkness that would come with death. At least soon she would be warm again. Soon she would see her parents. Soon she would be free. "I'm sorry," she whispered to no one. "I tried to be strong. I tried not to be a burden. I'm so sorry." The snow continued to fall, covering her still form like a burial shroud. Somewhere in the distance, a wolf howled, and the mountain answered with an avalanche of silence. Eleanor Whitfield closed her sightless eyes and waited for the end, unaware that sometimes fate has other plans for those who have lost everything, unaware that somewhere on the mountain, a scarred man was about to hear a cry for help carried on the wind. Samuel had been checking his trap lines when the storm rolled in, faster and fiercer than expected. He knew these mountains well enough to find shelter, had hunkered down beneath a rock overhang to wait out the worst of it. But the wind carried something that made him pause, a human voice, high and desperate, crying for help. He tried to ignore it, told himself it was just the wind playing tricks, the way it sometimes did in the high passes. But the cry came again, weaker this time, and something in his chest tightened. No one should be out in weather like this. The trail to town was treacherous enough in good conditions. Samuel pulled his coat tighter and ventured into the white wall of the storm, moving by instinct and memory. His scarred face, usually hidden beneath his hat brim, was fully exposed to the biting wind, but the cold dulled the constant ache in the damaged tissue. He almost stumbled over her, a small form curled in the snow. So still he thought at first he was too late, but when he knelt beside her, he could see the faint rise and fall of her chest. A woman, young from what he could tell, dressed in city clothes wholly inadequate for a mountain storm. "Miss," he touched her shoulder gently, his voice rougher than usual from disuse. "Can you hear me?" Her eyelids fluttered, revealing blue eyes that stared past him into nothing. "Please," she whispered through lips already tinged with blue. I can't see. Please don't leave me." "Blind." Samuel's hand hesitated for just a moment before he scooped her into his arms. She weighed almost nothing, bird bones and wet fabric. Her head lolled against his chest as he stood, and he could feel how cold she was even through his thick coat. The journey back to his cabin was a battle against the wind. Samuel knew every rock, every tree, but the storm tried to tear his burden from his arms with icy fingers. The woman stirred occasionally, mumbling words he couldn't make out over the howling gale. Once, her hand clutched at his coat, and he found himself speaking to her. Nonsense reassurances that the wind stole before they could reach her ears. By the time he shouldered open his door, his arms were screaming, and his bad leg, the one that had been pinned under the burning beam, was threatening to buckle. He laid her on his bed, the only bed in the cabin, and hurried to build up the fire he'd banked that morning. The warmth revealed what the snow had hidden. Her fine traveling dress was soaked through, her lips blue, her skin pale as porcelain. Samuel had seen enough frontier winters to know the signs of killing cold. If he didn't act fast, she'd be dead within the hour. He hesitated, his hands hovering over the buttons of her dress. In another life, when his face had been whole and he'd been a respectable member of the community, propriety would have demanded he find a woman to tend her. But there was no one else, only him, the monster of the mountain, and this half-frozen girl who couldn't even see what he was. "Forgive me," he muttered, and began the necessary work of saving her life. He worked with clinical efficiency, stripping away the wet garments, wrapping her in his woolen blankets, positioning her close to the fire, but not too close. Her ankle was swollen and purple, not broken, he thought, but badly sprained. There were cuts on her hands, her knees, evidence of falls and desperate crawling. Samuel heated water, made tea with herbs he'd learned from an old trapper, remedies for cold and shock. He held her head up, coaxed the liquid between her lips. She swallowed reflexively. A good sign. "That's it," he found himself saying. "Come back to the world. Miss, you're safe now." Her eyes opened again, those unseeing blue depths that seemed to look right through him. "Where?" "You're in my cabin. Found you in the storm." He kept his voice low, aware of how it must sound with his damaged mouth. "What were you doing out there?" "The wagon," she said, her voice stronger now, though still threaded with confusion. "Mister, Turner was taking me to my uncle's ranch. The wheel stuck, and then I couldn't find him. I called and called." Samuel frowned. He knew most of the ranchers in these parts, knew their hands. "Turner, you said? Jake Turner?" "Jacob Turner. Yes. Do you know him? Is he all right?" Samuel's frown deepened. Jake Turner was a mean drunk who'd been run out of 2 counties for his treatment of horses and women alike. What was he doing transporting a blind woman in a storm? "I'll look for him when the storm passes," Samuel said, though privately he suspected Turner had abandoned her the moment trouble arose. It wouldn't be the first time the man had saved his own skin at another's expense. The woman struggled to sit up, the blankets slipping from her shoulders. Samuel quickly turned away, though he realized a moment later the gesture was pointless. She couldn't see his impropriety or his scars. "I need to get to my uncle," she said. "Cornelius Whitfield. He's expecting me." Old Cornelius? Samuel couldn't hide his surprise. The man was a hermit who made Samuel look sociable, a bitter widower who'd grown meaner with each passing year. "He's your kin." "My mother's brother. I had nowhere else to go after." She trailed off, and Samuel heard the weight of story untold. "Storm won't break before morning, maybe longer," he said. "You're not going anywhere on that ankle anyway. Rest now. You're safe here." She was quiet for a long moment. Then, in a smaller voice, "I don't even know your name." Samuel hesitated. Once she knew who he was, even blind. She'd likely recoil. The stories would have reached even Philadelphia, but lying felt wrong. Here in the firelight with her trusting presence. "Samuel Hawthorne," he said finally. He waited for recognition, for fear, but she only nodded. "Eleanor Whitfield. Thank you, Mr. Hawthorne. I thought I was going to die out there." "You nearly did." He busied himself making more tea. keeping his back to her even though it didn't matter. Old habits. Temperatures dropping fast. If I hadn't heard you. How did you hear me, in that wind? How to explain that he'd learned to listen to the mountain's every mood? That isolation had sharpened his senses until he could hear a rabbit's heartbeat in the snow. Lucky, I guess. She made a sound that might have been a laugh if it weren't so full of bitterness. Lucky. That's not a word I've heard much lately. Samuel glanced at her over his shoulder. She'd pulled the blankets up to her chin, but her face was turned toward the fire's warmth. In the flickering light, he could see she was younger than he'd first thought. Maybe 25 at most. Pretty, too, in that delicate city way that didn't usually last long in frontier country. How long? He asked quietly. She didn't pretend to misunderstand. Almost a year. Fever took my sight and everything else with it. Her voice caught on the last words. Samuel knew about losing everything. He turned back to the fire, adding another log. I'm sorry. Are you? There was challenge in her voice now. Most people just see a burden, something broken that can't be fixed, shipped off to whoever will take it. The words hit closer to home than she could know. Samuel's hand went unconsciously to his scarred cheek. Some things can't be fixed, he said. Doesn't make them worthless. Eleanor was quiet for a long time. When she spoke again, her voice was thoughtful. You speak like someone who knows. Samuel didn't answer. Instead, he ladled soup from the pot he always kept simmering, venison and root vegetables. Simple but nourishing. You need to eat, he said. Get your strength back. He helped her sit up properly, arranged the blankets to preserve her modesty, then placed the bowl in her hands. She felt for the spoon, found it, but her hands shook so badly that more soup ended up on the blankets than in her mouth. I'm sorry, she said, tears of frustration gathering in her sightless eyes. I'm not usually so helpless. At home, I could, but everything here is strange. Without thinking, Samuel reached for the bowl. No shame in needing help. He fed her carefully, patiently, the way he'd once fed an injured fawn he'd nursed through a harsh winter. Eleanor accepted each spoonful without protest, though he could see what it cost her pride. There, he said when the bowl was empty. Better? Yes, thank you. She tilted her head, that unseeing gaze somehow still penetrating. Your voice. Are you hurt? Samuel's hand went again to his scars. Old injury, he said shortly. I'm sorry, I didn't mean to pry. You didn't? Natural question. They sat in awkward silence, the fire crackling between them. Outside, the storm raged on, sealing them in this strange bubble of warmth and unexpected intimacy. Samuel found himself studying her face, the way the firelight caught in her hair, the determined set of her jaw despite everything she'd been through. Mr. Hawthorne, she said suddenly, I need to, that is there a necessity? It took him a moment to understand. Ah, yes, here. He helped her stand, guided her to the corner where he'd installed a privacy screen and the basic amenities. Can you manage? I've had a year to learn, she said with dignity. While she was occupied, Samuel quickly changed the sheets on his bed, laid out one of his clean shirts for her to wear. Her dress was ruined, would need days to dry properly. He tried not to think about how intimate this all was. A strange woman in his bed, wearing his clothes. When she emerged, moving carefully with one hand on the wall, he guided her back to the bed. You'll sleep here tonight. I'll take the floor by the fire. I can't take your bed. You can and you will. His tone brooked no argument. That ankle needs to be elevated. Besides, floor's probably warmer. Heat rises. It was a lie, but she didn't need to know that. She settled back against the pillows with a soft sigh, and Samuel could see exhaustion pulling at her. The storm, she murmured. How long will it last? Day or two, maybe 3. He pulled the blankets up to her chin. Sleep now. You're safe. Safe, she repeated, already half asleep. Funny, I haven't felt safe in so long. Her hand found his, squeezed gently. Thank you, Samuel Hawthorne. Whoever you are. Samuel stood frozen as her breathing deepened into sleep. Her hand was still in his, soft and trusting. He couldn't remember the last time someone had touched him without flinching. Carefully, he extracted his hand and moved to his workbench, though he made no pretense of working. Instead, he watched her sleep. This unexpected guest who'd literally blown into his life. She couldn't see his scars, would never recoil from his ruined face. For the first time in 3 years, he was just a man to someone. Just Samuel Hawthorne, not the monster of the mountain. The storm howled outside, but inside the cabin was warm and quiet, filled with the soft breathing of two souls who'd found unexpected shelter from more than just the weather. The storm raged for 3 days, sealing them in a world of white silence broken only by the wind's howling and the crack of ice-laden branches. Eleanor woke the first morning disoriented, her hands searching the unfamiliar textures of wool blankets and rough-hewn walls until memory returned. She was in the cabin of Samuel Hawthorne, the man who'd saved her life. "You're awake." His voice came from somewhere near the fireplace, that rough timbre she was beginning to recognize. "How's the ankle?" Eleanor carefully flexed her foot, wincing at the sharp pain. "Sore, but better. I think, Mr. Hawthorne, I need to—" "Samuel," he interrupted. "Just Samuel. And there's a chamber pot behind the screen. Can you make it?" She felt heat rise in her cheeks, but nodded. This was her life now, depending on strangers for the most basic needs. She swung her legs over the edge of the bed, testing her weight. The ankle protested but held. "Here." A walking stick was pressed into her hand. "Carved it this morning while you slept. The right height for you, I think." Eleanor ran her fingers over the smooth wood, feeling the careful work that had gone into it. "You made this? For me?" "Had the wood. Seemed useful." His voice was gruff, embarrassed. She heard him move away, giving her privacy to navigate to the screen. When she emerged, she followed the sound of activity to where he was working. "What are you doing?" "Making breakfast, venison hash and biscuits." "I can help." The words tumbled out before she could stop them. "I mean, I know I'm blind, but I can cook. I just need to learn where things are." She heard his movements pause. "You want to cook?" "I need to be useful." Eleanor gripped the walking stick tighter. "I can't just sit here for days being waited on. Please." There was a long silence. Then, "All right, come here." He guided her to the small kitchen area, her hand on his arm. She could feel the strength there, the careful way he moved to accommodate her slower pace. He placed her hands on the table, the stove, the shelves. Cast iron skillet here, plates up here, flour, salt, lard in these tins. His hands covered hers, guiding them to each item. They were rough hands, calloused from work, but gentle in their instruction. Eleanor memorized each location, building a map in her mind. "What's this?" Her fingers found a row of small containers. "Herbs, rosemary, sage, thyme." He opened each one, letting her smell the contents. "Wild herbs from the mountain. Good for cooking and other things." "You know herb lore?" She was surprised. Most men she'd known considered such knowledge women's work. "Man alone learns what he needs to." There was a story there, but he didn't elaborate. "Think you can manage the biscuits while I finish the hash?" Eleanor nodded, eager to prove herself. She'd made biscuits thousands of times before the fever. Surely her hands would remember even if her eyes couldn't guide them. But everything was different. The flour felt wrong, coarser than what she'd used in Philadelphia. She couldn't judge the amount of lard, couldn't see if the dough was the right consistency. Her first attempt was a disaster, too wet, sticky, falling apart in her hands. "I'm sorry," she said, near tears. "I'm making a mess." Everyone makes a mess their first time. Samuel's voice held no judgment. Here. He moved behind her, his hands covering hers on the dough. Less liquid in the mountain air. Flour's different too. Local mill grinds it coarser. Feel that? That's the texture you want. Eleanor tried to focus on the lesson, but she was acutely aware of his presence, the warmth of him at her back. He smelled of wood smoke and pine, honest scents that reminded her of her father's workshop when she was small. Together, they shaped the biscuits and got them in the oven. Eleanor's second attempt was better. Her third, better still. By the fourth batch, she was managing alone, her confidence growing with each small success. These are good, Samuel said over breakfast, and she could hear the surprise in his voice. Really good. Don't sound so shocked, Eleanor said, allowing herself a small smile. I wasn't always useless. You're not useless now. The simple statement, said so matter-of-factly, brought tears to her eyes. She blinked them back, focusing on her food. Tell me about the cabin, she said to change the subject. It feels well-made. Built it myself after... He paused. After I needed a new place. Took 2 seasons. Working alone. Every board cut and placed by hand. You're a carpenter, then... Had a lumber mill down in town. Before, Eleanor was beginning to understand that word, the way it divided life into then and now. I was going to be a teacher, she offered, before. Had a position lined up at a school for young ladies. What happened? Blind teachers aren't much use. Can't see the blackboard, can't read the lessons, can't watch for misbehavior. She tried to keep the bitterness from her voice. The school was very understanding, of course, very sorry, but rules are rules. They finished breakfast in companionable silence. Eleanor insisted on washing up, learning the location of the water bucket, the wash basin, the precious soap. Samuel protested at first. Her ankles still pained her, but seemed to understand her need to contribute. The days fell into a rhythm. Morning chores shared between them. Eleanor learning the cabin's geography through careful exploration. Afternoons by the fire. Samuel working on his carvings while Eleanor knitted. Her fingers still remembered the stitches, even if she couldn't see the results. What are you making? She asked on the second day, hearing the steady scrape of knife on wood. Toy. Wooden horse for Watson's store. May I? She held out her hand, and after a moment's hesitation, he placed the carving in her palm. Her fingers traced the delicate details, the flowing mane, the proud arch of the neck, the tiny wheels that would let a child pull it along. It's beautiful, she breathed. The children will love it. They won't know I made it. There was no self-pity in the statement, just fact. Watson sells them, but doesn't say where they come from. Why not? Silence stretched between them. Finally, because I'm the scarred man, the monster parents used to frighten their children into behaving. Eleanor's fingers stilled on the wooden horse. Is that what happened to your voice? The scars? Fire. 3 years ago? The words came haltingly, as if pulled from deep storage. Mill caught. The boarding house next door, too. Got some folks out, but... He touched his face, a gesture Eleanor couldn't see but somehow sensed. Beam came down, trapped me. By the time they pulled me free, well, you can imagine. You saved people. 3 people. Mrs. Morrison and her 2 grandchildren. Then you're a hero. Samuel's laugh was bitter. Heroes don't have faces that make children scream. Heroes don't have to shop at dawn to avoid decent folks. Heroes don't live alone on mountains because nowhere else will have them. Eleanor set the wooden horse carefully aside and reached out, her hand finding his arm. Tell me about your face. He went rigid under her touch. Eleanor, tell me. Her voice was gentle but firm. I'll never see it, so you'll have to be my eyes. Describe it to me. For a long moment, she thought he'd refuse. Then, Slowly, he took her hand and raised it to his face. The right side is normal, what I used to look like. He guided her fingers across stubbled cheek, strong jaw, the corner of his mouth. But here, he moved her hand to the left side, and she felt the difference immediately. Ridged scar tissue, skin pulled tight, strange textures where smooth flesh should be. She traced the damage carefully, building a picture in her mind. Does it hurt? Sometimes. Cold makes it ache. Heat, too. His voice was barely a whisper. You're the first person to touch it, since the doctors... Eleanor cupped his face between both hands, thumb stroking the scarred cheek. I'm glad it doesn't frighten me, she said simply. Since I can't see it, you're just Samuel to me, the man who saved my life, the man who made me a walking stick. The man teaching me to make biscuits in mountain air. She felt him tremble under her touch, heard his breathing catch. Then, gently, he pulled away. The storm's getting worse. I should check the wood pile. He fled to the door, and Eleanor let him go, understanding his need for space. She'd lived with her own disfigurement, invisible though it was, long enough to recognize the patterns of shame and withdrawal. While he was gone, she explored more of the cabin, memorizing each surface, each obstacle. Her fingers found his bookshelf, traced the spines of well-worn volumes, found his carving tools, each one carefully maintained, found a small framed photograph on the mantel, the glass cracked. That was taken before, Samuel said from behind her. She hadn't heard him return. My parents, they died when I was 15. Fever took them both the same winter. I'm sorry. She carefully replaced the photograph. My parents are gone too. 5 years now. Is that why you're going to Cornelius? No other family? Eleanor sank into the chair by the fire. My sister Margaret. But her husband, Charles, said I was a burden. Bad for the children to see their aunt so afflicted. Bad for his business reputation. Bastard. The word slipped out, followed quickly by, pardon my language. No, you're right. He is a bastard. It felt good to say it out loud. But Margaret needs him. She has 3 children, no money of her own. So when Charles decided I had to go, she let him. She cried. Eleanor pulled Samuel's borrowed shirt closer around her. Her dress still wasn't dry. But yes, she let him. They sat quietly, listening to the storm. After a while, Samuel began describing what he could see through the window, the way snow gathered on pine branches until they bowed under the weight, the tracks of a rabbit seeking shelter, the purple gray of the storm clouds. I used to love watching storms, Eleanor said. The way lightning would illuminate everything for just a moment. Now it's just sound and fury. Nothing more. I could tell you what I see. When there's something worth seeing. The offer was tentative, uncertain. Be your eyes when you need them. Eleanor smiled. The first real smile she'd felt in months. I'd like that. And I don't know. What do you need that I could offer? You're already doing it. His voice was so quiet she almost missed it. You're here, talking to me like I'm a person. That's more than I've had in 3 years. On the 3rd night, the storm finally began to break. Eleanor could hear the change in the wind, feel the shift in air pressure. Tomorrow, perhaps the day after, the roads would be passable. She'd have to leave, go to her uncle's ranch, face whatever cold welcome awaited her there. The thought filled her with unexpected dread. Play something, Samuel said suddenly. He'd noticed her mood. She realized, sometime in the past 3 days, they'd learned to read each other's silences. I don't have an instrument. Sing, then you must know songs. Eleanor did know songs. Her mother had taught her dozens, hymns and folk tunes and silly ditties for the children. She'd stopped singing after the fever, her joy buried under the weight of loss. But here, In this cabin where she wasn't Eleanor the burden, but just Eleanor, she found her voice again. She sang Barbara Allen, that old ballad of love and loss, and heard Samuel's breath catch at the sweet sorrow of it. Sang Shenandoah, and he hummed along in his rough voice. Sang lullabies she'd once used to quiet her sister's babies, and felt tears slip down her cheeks for all the children she'd never have. "That was beautiful," Samuel said when she finally fell silent. "You have a gift." "Another useless one. Who wants to hear a blind woman sing?" "I do." The simple honesty in his voice undid her. "Why are you so kind to me?" The question burst out before she could stop it. "You don't know me. I'm just another burden blown in by the storm." "You're not a burden." Samuel moved closer. She could feel the warmth of him beside her chair. You're unexpected. 3 days ago, I was alone on this mountain. Had been for 3 years. Figured I'd die alone too. Then you came, and suddenly I'm teaching someone to cook, describing snow on pine branches, listening to songs by my fire. You're not a burden. Eleanor, you're a gift. A broken gift. The best ones often are. His hand found hers, rough fingers gentle around her own. Perfection's overrated. It's the cracks that let the light in. Eleanor turned her hand in his, intertwining their fingers. 2 damaged souls in a cabin while the storm died outside, finding in each other something they'd thought lost forever. Not healing, not yet, but hope. Tomorrow would bring challenges. The road to town. Her uncle's cold welcome. The stares and whispers of strangers. But tonight, she was safe in a warm cabin with a man who saw her as more than her blindness, just as she saw him as more than his scars. "Sing another," Samuel requested softly. "Something happy this time." And Eleanor, surprising herself, laughed and launched into Old Dan Tucker, complete with silly voices. Samuel's rare laugh joined hers, and for a moment, in the fire-lit darkness they both inhabited in their own ways, the world felt less broken. The morning sun broke through the clouds as Samuel helped Eleanor down from his wagon, her hand gripping his arm for support. The main street of Redemption stretched before them, muddy from the melted snow, busy with folks emerging after the storm. Eleanor couldn't see the stairs, but she could feel them, the sudden hush of conversation, the whispers that followed in their wake. "People are looking," she said quietly. "They always do." Samuel's voice was steady, but she felt the tension in his arm. "Your uncle's house is just ahead, the old Whitfield place." Eleanor had dressed in her own clothes, dried and mended by Samuel's careful hands. She looked respectable again, a proper lady despite her blindness. Samuel had even fashioned her a better walking stick, sanded smooth and perfectly balanced. But respectability felt like armor she no longer wanted to wear. "That's far enough, monster!" The voice was cold, cultured, and Eleanor felt Samuel stop abruptly. Footsteps approached, confident, expensive boots on wooden boardwalk. "Miss Whitfield, I presume. I'm Harrison Blackwood, your uncle's attorney. He sent word you were expected days ago." "The storm," Eleanor began. "Yes, we found Turner's body yesterday, frozen under his wagon. Unfortunate." Blackwood's tone suggested it was more inconvenient than unfortunate. "What I cannot fathom is why you're arriving in the company of this creature." Eleanor's hand tightened on Samuel's arm. "Mister, Hawthorne saved my life. I would have died in that storm if not for him." "Hawthorne." Blackwood drew out the name like it tasted sour. "The scarred man, Miss Whitfield. Surely you understand the impropriety. A young lady, unchaperoned, in the cabin of a man like that." "A man like what?" Eleanor's voice cut sharp. "A hero, because that's what he is. Or didn't anyone tell you how he got those scars? Saving people from a fire?" She heard Blackwood's sharp intake of breath, murmurs from the gathering crowd. Someone whispered, "She doesn't know what he looks like. Poor thing." "Miss Whitfield." Blackwood's tone turned condescending. Your affliction perhaps prevents you from understanding. This man is standing right here, Samuel interrupted quietly, and ready to leave. Eleanor, you're safe now. Your uncle's man will take care of you. Samuel, wait. But he was already pulling away, her hand slipping from his arm. She heard his uneven gait, the limp she'd noticed but never mentioned, moving away from her. For the best, Blackwood said briskly. Now, your uncle is waiting. Boy, he called to someone. Take Miss Whitfield's trunk. Eleanor allowed herself to be led away, but her heart stayed behind with the sound of Samuel's retreating footsteps. The walk to her uncle's house was short, but felt eternal. Blackwood kept up a steady stream of commentary about the town, her uncle's standing, the importance of propriety, but Eleanor heard none of it. The house, when they reached it, smelled of dust and disuse. No warmth in the greeting from the housekeeper, Mrs. Garrett, who took Eleanor's arm with efficiency but no kindness. Mr. Whitfield is in his study, she announced. He doesn't like to be kept waiting. Cornelius Whitfield was a voice from behind a desk. Gruff, impatient, already irritated by her presence. So, you're Mary's girl. Blind. They tell me. Yes, Uncle. Can you work? Yes, sir. I can cook, clean, tend house. With those eyes? Doubtful. But we'll see. Can't have idleness under my roof. Mrs. Garrett will show you your room. Supper's at 6 sharp. Don't be late. That was all. No word of sympathy for her ordeal. No concern for her health. Eleanor was led to a small room at the back of the house. She could tell by the cold, the distance from the main fireplace, the narrow bed, the single chair, the small table, a servant's quarters. Not a niece's room. Your duties start tomorrow, Mrs. Garrett informed her. Mr. Whitfield expects his breakfast at 7, lunch at noon, supper at 6. You'll help with cooking and such tasks as you can manage. Any questions? No, ma'am. What was the point? This was her life now. The days that followed were a blur of harsh routine. Eleanor struggled with unfamiliar layouts, burned herself on stoves she couldn't see, broke dishes she couldn't catch. Her uncle's criticism was constant and cutting. Useless, he'd mutter when she stumbled. Should have left you to rot in Philadelphia. Mrs. Garrett was no kinder, seeming to take pleasure in Eleanor's failures. Only at night, alone in her cold room, did Eleanor allow herself to remember those 3 days in Samuel's cabin. The warmth, the patience, the simple acceptance of her as she was. 2 weeks passed before she heard his name again. She was at the general store with Mrs. Garrett, holding the basket while the older woman shopped, when she heard Watson speaking to another customer. Fine work, as always. Your Samuel's got skilled hands, even if the rest of him's a fright. These toys'll sell well for Christmas. Eleanor's heart leaped. Excuse me, Mr. Watson? You mentioned Samuel Hawthorne? She felt the store go quiet. Watson cleared his throat. Yes, miss, he brings in carvings to sell. Good work, though I don't advertise where they come from. Bad for business, you understand. Could you give him a message? Eleanor? Mrs. Garrett's voice was sharp. We don't associate with that man. Come along. But Eleanor stood firm. Just a message, Mr. Watson. Please, tell him. Tell him thank you for everything. Watson mumbled something that might have been agreement. And Mrs. Garrett dragged Eleanor away, scolding all the way home. Word of Eleanor's request spread quickly, as gossip did in small towns. Shameful, she heard women whispering at church. Poor thing doesn't understand what she's asking. Defending that monster. Her uncle ought to keep a tighter rein. It's the blindness. Affects the mind sometimes. Eleanor bore it all in silence. But inside, Anger built like a banked fire. These people who spoke of Christian charity but showed none, who judged a man by his scars rather than his actions, who saw her blindness as madness rather than simply a different way of being in the world. The confrontation came 3 weeks after her arrival. Harrison Blackwood joined them for supper, speaking of business with her uncle while Eleanor served silently. Talk turned to local matters, and Blackwood mentioned Samuel. "The scarred man's been coming to town more often. Watson says he's been asking after Miss Whitfield. Perhaps it's time to have Sheriff Coleman warn him off." "I agree," Cornelius said. "Can't have him sniffing around my niece. Bad enough she arrived with him." "He saved my life," Eleanor said quietly, setting down the coffee pot. "You've been told not to speak of that," her uncle snapped. "Why? Because it's true? Because it doesn't fit your picture of him as a monster?" Eleanor's hands shook, but her voice grew stronger. "That man showed me more kindness in 3 days than I've found in 3 weeks under this roof." "Eleanor, Mrs. Garrett gasped. "He made me a walking stick, taught me to cook at altitude, described the world when I couldn't see it. He treated me like a person, not a burden or a charity case or a problem to be solved." "You forget yourself." Cornelius rose from his chair, voice thunderous. "That creature is an abomination. His face is God's judgment on whatever sin—" "His face is the result of saving 3 lives," Eleanor shouted back. "What have you done that's so noble? What has anyone in this town done besides whisper and judge and congratulate themselves on their unmarred faces?" The slap caught her across the cheek, sending her stumbling. She caught herself on the table, cheek burning, tears of rage and pain starting in her eyes. "You will go to your room," Cornelius said coldly. "You will not speak of that man again, and if I hear you've tried to contact him, you'll find yourself on the street. Blind or not, family or not, I won't harbor such disgraceful behavior." Eleanor straightened, dignity wrapped around her like armor. "I understand perfectly. Uncle, you've made it clear what kind of man you are." She made her way to her room without assistance, locked the door, and sank onto the narrow bed. Her cheek throbbed, but worse was the ache in her chest. She thought of Samuel alone in his cabin, thought of the gentleness in his damaged voice, the patience in his scarred hands. Outside her window, she heard an owl calling in the darkness. Samuel had taught her to identify it by its sound, a great horned owl. He'd said, "Hunter of the night." She pressed her hand to the glass, wondering if he could see the same stars she couldn't, if he thought of her at all. In the main house, she heard Blackwood take his leave, heard her uncle's heavy tread on the stairs. The house settled into uneasy sleep, but Eleanor remained at the window, planning. She couldn't stay here, wouldn't stay here. But where could a blind woman go? What options did she have? "None," whispered the practical voice in her head. "You're trapped." But another voice, one that sounded remarkably like Samuel's, whispered back, "The best ones often are broken. It's the cracks that let the light in." Eleanor touched her bruised cheek and made a decision. She wouldn't try to contact Samuel. She wouldn't risk bringing her uncle's wrath down on him. But she wouldn't forget him either. Wouldn't let this town's poison turn her into another bitter soul, judging by surfaces rather than substance. Somewhere on the mountain, a scarred man crafted beautiful toys for children who would never know his name. And in a cold back room, a blind woman held on to the memory of 3 days when she'd been seen truly, scars and all. The owl called again, and Eleanor finally moved from the window. Tomorrow would bring more criticism, more impossible tasks, more reminders of what she'd lost. But it would also bring the chance to remember what she'd found. That kindness could exist in unexpected places. That broken didn't mean worthless. That sometimes the monsters were the ones who looked perfectly whole. She lay down fully clothed, unwilling to be any more vulnerable than necessary in this house. Her fingers found the walking stick Samuel had made. Traced the careful smoothness of it, such patience in its crafting, such care for someone he'd just met. "Thank you," she whispered to the darkness, hoping somehow the words would find their way up the mountain. "For seeing me, just me." The house creaked around her, settling into night. But Eleanor lay awake, planning and remembering, holding on to hope as tightly as she held the walking stick. She'd found something in that storm, in that cabin, in that scarred man's kindness, and no amount of slaps or threats or proper society's judgment could take it away. She just had to figure out how to find her way back to it. The December cold bit through Eleanor's thin shawl as she stood in the parlor, Harrison Blackwood's voice filling the space with practiced charm. It had been 2 months since the storm, 2 months of drudgery in her uncle's house, and now this, a proposal that felt more like a business transaction than a declaration of love. "You must see the sense in it, Miss Whitfield," Blackwood was saying. "A woman in your condition needs protection, security. I'm offering you a respectable position as my wife. You'll want for nothing." Eleanor kept her face carefully neutral, though inside she recoiled. She'd learned to hide her emotions in this house, learned that any show of spirit brought swift retribution. "Mr. Blackwood, I'm honored by your offer, but—" "Come now," her uncle interrupted from his chair by the fire. "Don't play coy, girl. You know perfectly well this is more than you could hope for. A blind woman with no dowry. Harrison's being extraordinarily generous." "Indeed," Blackwood added, moving closer. Eleanor could smell his cologne. Too sweet, too strong. "I'm willing to overlook your unfortunate association with the scarred man. Your arrival in his company caused quite a scandal, but as my wife, that would be forgotten." "Forgotten by whom?" Eleanor asked quietly. "By proper society, of course. By everyone who matters." His hand found her elbow, possessive already. "I know you can't see it, but I'm quite a catch. My dear, handsome, successful, respected. You'd be the envy of many ladies." "And what would you gain?" The question slipped out before Eleanor could stop it. Blackwood's laugh was cold. "A wife, naturally. Someone to manage my household, host my business associates. Your blindness is unfortunate, but I have servants to compensate, and there's something to be said for a wife who can't see when her husband works late or travels for business." The implication hung in the air like smoke. Eleanor pulled her arm free, disgust rising in her throat. "I need time to consider." "What's to consider?" Cornelia snapped. "You'll accept, of course. The wedding will be after Christmas. Small. Naturally, no need for a spectacle." "Uncle, please, this is sudden." "Sudden?" Her uncle's chair creaked as he stood. "Girl, you've been nothing but a drain on my resources since you arrived. Bad enough I had to take you in. But now you dare refuse an offer that would see you settled? You'll accept Harrison's proposal and be grateful for it." "And if I don't?" The silence that followed was heavy with threat. When Cornelius spoke again, his voice was dangerously quiet. "Then you'll find yourself on the street come morning. See how far your pride takes you when you're begging for scraps in the snow?" Eleanor felt the walls closing in, the trap springing shut. Accept Blackwood and become his possession, a convenient hostess who couldn't see his indiscretions, or refuse and face the winter streets, blind and alone, with nowhere to go. I need air," she managed. "Please, just a moment to compose myself." 5 minutes, her uncle granted. "Then you'll return and give Harrison your answer." Eleanor fumbled her way to the back door. Stepping into the frigid night, her breath came in short gasps, panic clawing at her chest. She couldn't marry Blackwood. The thought of his hands on her, that cologne drowning her, living a lie as his unseeing wife. She'd rather face the streets. But where could she go? She had no money, no friends in town, no options, unless... Samuel's face rose in her memory. Those gentle hands teaching her to cook, that rough voice describing the world, the cabin that had felt more like home in 3 days than her uncle's house had in 2 months. But she'd promised not to contact him, not to bring trouble to his door, and showing up at his cabin, begging for shelter, What right did she have? He'd saved her once. She couldn't ask him to do it again. Miss Eleanor. The whispered voice made her jump. A small hand tugged at her skirt. It's me, Miss Tom Watson, from the store. Eleanor knelt, recognizing the voice of Watson's youngest son. Tom, what are you doing out so late? Pa sent me, said to give you this and not let anyone see. He pressed something into her hand, a small wooden carving. Her fingers traced the shape, a bird, wings spread in flight. Mister, Samuel's been leaving these for you, Tom whispered. One every week when he brings his other carvings. Pa's been keeping them, but when he heard about Mr. Blackwood coming to dinner tonight... Eleanor's throat tightened. Samuel had been thinking of her, sending messages the only way he could. Thank you, Tom. Thank your father, too. Pa says to tell you. The boy paused, then rushed on. He says, Mister. Samuel asked about you, every week. Asked if you were well, if you were. Happy. Happy? Eleanor almost laughed at the word. What did your father tell him? The truth, miss, that you look tired, that your uncle works you hard, that folks say mean things about you defending Mr. Samuel. Tom's voice dropped even lower. Pa thinks Mr. Blackwood's a snake. Miss says so to Ma when he thinks us kids can't hear. Eleanor, her uncle's voice boomed from inside. Your time's up. I have to go, Eleanor said, clutching the carved bird. Thank you, Tom. Run home now. The boy scampered off, and Eleanor straightened her spine. She walked back inside, the little wooden bird hidden in her palm like a talisman. Well? Blackwood's voice was impatient. Your answer, Miss Whitfield. Eleanor took a breath, feeling the smooth wood against her skin, drawing courage from it. My answer is no, Mr. Blackwood. I cannot marry you. The explosion was immediate. Her uncle's roar of rage, Blackwood's indignant sputtering. Mrs. Garrett's gasp from the doorway. But Eleanor stood firm, even when her uncle grabbed her arm, shaking her. You ungrateful wretch! After all I've done! Done! Eleanor wrenched free. You've worked me like a servant, fed me scraps, housed me in quarters fit for a dog. You've shown me nothing but contempt and criticism. And now you try to sell me to the highest bidder. Sell? Blackwood sounded genuinely offended. I offered marriage. You offered ownership. Eleanor shot back. A blind wife who couldn't see your sins, wouldn't notice your absences, would serve as your hostess and ask no questions. That's not marriage, Mr. Blackwood. That's purchasing a well-dressed servant. How dare you? I dare because I have nothing left to lose. Eleanor turned toward where she knew her uncle stood. You want me gone? Fine. I'll leave at first light. But I won't be sold to soothe your conscience or fill your coffers. Tonight, Cornelius snarled. You'll leave tonight. Take your things and get out. Find your own way, since you're so particular about the help offered you. Uncle, please. Now. The word cracked like a whip. Mrs. Garrett, help her pack. I want her gone within the hour. Eleanor heard Blackwood protesting, something about the impropriety of turning her out at night. But her uncle was beyond reason. She was hustled to her room, her few belongings thrown into her trunk. Mrs. Garrett said nothing, but her rough handling spoke volumes. Within the promised hour, Eleanor stood on the street, her trunk at her feet, the winter night closing around her. The wooden bird was still clutched in her hand, its wings cutting into her palm. 30 years I've served this family. Mrs. Garrett finally spoke. Never seen such ingratitude. Then she was gone, the door slamming with finality. Eleanor heard the bolt slide home, shutting her out completely. She was alone on the dark street, blind and friendless, with nowhere to go. No, not nowhere, not friendless. Eleanor picked up her walking stick, Samuel's gift, and used it to find the edge of her trunk, She couldn't carry it far, but she could drag it to a safer spot, away from her uncle's door. Then she'd wait for dawn and somehow find her way to the mountain trail. "You lost, miss?" The voice was young, female. Eleanor turned toward it cautiously. "Who's there?" "Sally Morrison, my gran. She knows you. Knows who helped you in the storm." "Morrison." Eleanor's heart leaped. One of the people Samuel had saved from the fire. "Your grandmother survived the fire." "Thanks to him. Yes, miss. Gran saw what happened just now. Saw them turn you out. She sent me to fetch you." "I couldn't impose. Gran says you can and you will." Sally's young voice was firm. "Says anyone who speaks up for the man who saved us is welcome under our roof. Just for tonight. Mind, but in the morning." "Yes?" "Gran says she knows someone who might help. Someone who lives alone and could use a housekeeper. Someone who already thinks kindly of you." Eleanor's eyes filled with tears. The wooden bird seemed to warm in her hand. Thank you so much." Sally took her arm, gentle but sure. "Come on then, it's cold, and Gran's got soup on. Tomorrow we'll sort the rest." As they walked away from the house that had never been home, Eleanor thought of Samuel alone on his mountain. Tomorrow, if the Morrisons meant what she hoped they meant, she'd see him again. This time not as a burden blown in by a storm, but as a woman choosing her own path. The wooden bird's wings pressed into her palm, a promise of flight, of freedom, of finding her way back to the only place that had felt like home since she'd lost her sight. Eleanor lifted her face to the cold night air and smiled. Sometimes being cast out was just another way of being set free. Behind them, in the big cold house, Harrison Blackwood made his excuses and left. Cornelius Whitfield sat alone by his fire, nursing his rage and his whiskey, never guessing that he'd just lost something precious, the chance to know his niece's true worth. But such men rarely recognized treasure when it came in unexpected packages. And in a small, warm cottage on the other side of town, Mrs. Morrison ladled soup and told her granddaughter stories of a fire 3 years past, of a man who'd run toward danger instead of away, and of how sometimes the best families were the ones you chose, not the ones you were born to. The morning sun was weak through the clouds as Eleanor began her journey up the mountain. Mrs. Morrison had packed her a bundle of food and pressed a worn coat into her hands. "It was my daughter's," she'd said simply. Sally had walked her to the trailhead, describing the landmarks she'd need to remember. "The path splits 3 times," Sally had explained. "Always take the left fork. When you hear the creek, you're halfway there. His cabin sits where the trees thin out. You'll feel the wind change." Now Eleanor climbed alone, her walking stick testing each step. The carved bird was tucked safe in her pocket, a talisman against doubt. Snow crunched beneath her boots, and the cold air burned her lungs. But she pressed on. She had to reach Samuel before the threatened storm arrived, and before her courage failed, the first fork came sooner than expected. Eleanor felt carefully with her stick until she found the left path, narrower and steeper. Her ankle, never properly healed, protested each step, but she ignored it. She'd endured worse pain in her uncle's house, the pain of being unwanted, useless, trapped. Time lost meaning as she climbed. The world narrowed to the tap of her stick, the crunch of snow, the growing ache in her legs. When she finally heard the creek Sally had mentioned, Eleanor nearly wept with relief. Halfway there, she stopped to rest on what felt like a fallen log, eating some of Mrs. Morrison's bread and cheese. The forest was quiet around her, just wind in the pines and the distant call of birds. So different from the constant noise of her uncle's house, the criticism, the demands, the reminders of her worthlessness. "I choose this," she said aloud, needing to hear the words. "Whatever comes, I choose this." The second part of the climb was harder. The path grew rockier, and twice Eleanor stumbled, catching herself on trees. Her hands were scraped raw through her thin gloves. But she kept going. The third fork almost defeated her. Both paths felt the same. But then she remembered Sally's words about the wind, and chose the path where the air moved differently. The trees were thinning now. She could feel it in the way sound carried. And then, between one step and the next, she smelled wood smoke. Her heart hammered as she followed the scent, stick sweeping wider arcs, searching for obstacles. "Eleanor?" The voice came from her left, rough with disbelief. She turned toward it, tears starting in her eyes. "Samuel?" she breathed. I know I shouldn't be here. I know you didn't invite me, but I had nowhere else." The rest of her words were lost as strong arms pulled her against a broad chest. She felt him trembling, heard his breathing catch. For a long moment, they stood frozen, clinging to each other like survivors of a shipwreck. "You're half frozen," he said finally, pulling back. "Come inside. We'll sort the rest later." He led her to the cabin, her hand on his arm, and Eleanor nearly sobbed at the familiar warmth that enveloped her. The same smells: wood smoke, pine, the herbs hanging from the rafters. The same sounds: fire crackling, wind singing through the chinks. Home. Her heart whispered. "Sit," Samuel ordered, guiding her to the chair by the fire. "Your hands are bleeding." "It's nothing." "It's not nothing." His voice was gruff as he knelt before her, taking her scraped hands in his. "Eleanor, what happened? Why are you here?" The story poured out as he tended her hands. Her uncle's treatment, Blackwood's proposal, the midnight eviction. Samuel's hand stilled when she spoke of Blackwood's implications about wanting a blind wife who couldn't see his sins. "I'll kill him," he said quietly. "No." Eleanor gripped his hands. "He's not worth it. None of them are. I couldn't stay. Couldn't be sold like livestock. And Mrs. Morrison said..." "What did she say?" Eleanor's cheeks heated. "That you might need a housekeeper, that you'd been asking after me." She pulled the wooden bird from her pocket. "Tom Watson gave me this, said you'd been leaving them." Samuel's breath caught. I just wanted you to know someone was thinking of you, that you weren't alone." "I know." She traced the bird's wings. "They helped, more than you know. On the worst days, I'd hold them and remember." "Remember what?" "That once, for 3 days, someone saw me as more than a burden. That somewhere on this mountain was a man who made me feel like a person again." Samuel stood abruptly, moving to the window. "Eleanor, you can't stay here." Her heart plummeted. I understand. I shouldn't have presumed." "No." He turned back, and she heard him cross to her in 2 strides. "That's not what I mean. God knows I want you to stay. These past months..." He knelt again, taking her hands. "But think what you're asking. To live here, with me, unmarried. Your reputation is already ruined." Eleanor finished. "Don't you see? I arrived in your company. I defended you publicly. I refused Blackwood to his face. In town, I'm already fallen, at least here." "What?" "At least here I'd be fallen in the company of someone I choose. Someone who treats me with kindness instead of contempt." "Eleanor," her name was a prayer on his lips. "You don't know what you're saying. To tie yourself to me, to this isolation. I lived in isolation in a house full of people." She interrupted. "That's not the same as being alone. Samuel, these months in town taught me something. I'd rather live honestly on this mountain than live a lie in society's good graces." He was quiet for so long she feared she'd overstepped. Then, "It won't be easy. The winters are hard. The loneliness..." "Will I be lonely?" She reached out, found his scarred cheek. "With you here..." He turned his face into her palm, and she felt the wetness of tears. Eleanor, I'm not whole, not handsome, not what a woman dreams of." "No," she agreed, and felt him flinch. "You're kind, patient, gentle. You make beautiful things with your hands. You see me, really see me, when men with perfect eyes look right through me. That's better than handsome." "The town will talk. They already do." "Your family cast me out?" She stroked his scarred cheek. "Samuel, I'm not asking for promises. I'm not asking for anything except a chance. To stay, to work, to be useful, to build something with someone who sees my worth despite my blindness." "Because of it," he corrected fiercely. "Not despite it. Your blindness. Eleanor, you see clearer than anyone I've known. You saw past these scars to find me. Just me." They stayed like that, her hands framing his face, his covering hers, as the afternoon light slanted through the windows. Finally, Samuel spoke. "There's a room, small, but I could fix it up. You'd have privacy, propriety as much as we can manage. You could help with the house, the cooking. I could teach you the forest, help you learn the paths. And maybe you could sing again, like you did during the storm. The cabin's been too quiet since you left." Eleanor smiled, the first real smile in months. "I'd like that, all of it." "It's not much of a life I'm offering," he warned. "Hard work, isolation, the scorn of the town." "And companionship," she added. "Honest work, a home where I'm wanted, someone who describes the sunset without being asked. That's more than I had in my uncle's fine house." Samuel rose, pulling her up with him. "Then stay," he said simply. "Stay and make this cabin a home. Stay and let me be your eyes when you need them. Stay and let me learn to hope again." Eleanor reached up, finding his face, pulling him down until their foreheads touched. "We'll learn together," she whispered. Outside, the wind picked up, bringing the scent of snow. But inside the cabin, two broken people began the careful work of building something whole. Not perfect, nothing ever was, but real, honest, chosen. Samuel showed Eleanor to the small room, apologizing for its simplicity. She ran her hands over the sturdy bed, the small dresser, the window that faced east for morning sun. "It's perfect," she said, meaning it. "I'll start fixing it up tomorrow. New curtains, maybe a rug." "Samuel," she found his hand, squeezed it. "It's already more than I dreamed of." That evening, they shared a simple meal, falling back into the easy rhythm they'd found during the storm. Eleanor sang as she helped with dishes, her voice filling the cabin with warmth. Samuel told her about the changes on the mountain, new fox kits denning near the creek, an eagle's nest in the tall pine, the herbs he'd gathered for winter medicines. As night fell, they sat by the fire, comfortable in shared silence. Tomorrow would bring challenges. They'd need supplies from town, would have to face the gossip, the judgment. But tonight, they were just two souls who'd found safe harbor in each other. "Eleanor," Samuel's voice was tentative. "Are you sure? Once the town knows you're here, let them know," she said firmly. "Let them see that the scarred man and the blind woman have found something they never will, the courage to live honestly, without masks or pretense." He reached over, took her hand. "Then welcome home, Eleanor Whitfield." Home. The word settled into her chest like a living thing, warm and whole. She squeezed his hand back, feeling the calluses and scars, the strength and gentleness. "Thank you," she whispered, "for giving me a place to land." Outside, the first snowflakes began to fall, but inside the cabin, spring had already begun. The confrontation came 3 weeks later, on a crisp January morning when Samuel and Eleanor had ventured into town for supplies. They'd known it would happen eventually. The mountain couldn't shelter them from the world's judgment forever. Eleanor held Samuel's arm as they entered Watson's store, her head high despite the immediate hush that fell over the customers. She'd grown stronger these weeks, learning the mountain paths, finding her place in the cabin's rhythms. But here, surrounded by whispers and stares she couldn't see but could feel. The old vulnerabilities crept back. "Morning, Watson," Samuel said quietly. His voice steady despite the tension Eleanor felt in his arm. "Samuel." Watson's voice was carefully neutral. "Miss Whitfield. Heard you were staying up the mountain."
"She is."
Samuel's tone brooked no argument.
"We need flour, salt, coffee."
Well, the beauty and the beast." Harrison Blackwood's cultured voice cut through the store like a blade. Eleanor felt Samuel go rigid beside her, but she squeezed his arm in warning. They'd discussed this, prepared for it. "Mr. Blackwood," she acknowledged coolly. "Miss Whitfield, or should I say, the scarred man's woman now." His footsteps came closer. Expensive boots on wooden floors. "Your uncle is beside himself. The shame you've brought on the family name." "The only shame," Eleanor said clearly, "was in how he treated me, like property to be bartered." "Better than what you've become," Blackwood sneered. "Living in sin with that monster." "Careful." Samuel's voice was low, dangerous. "A man should mind his words." "Or what? You'll burn down my house too?" The accusation hung in the air like poison. Eleanor heard gasps from the other customers, felt the weight of their judgment. But before Samuel could respond, she stepped forward. "Mr. Watson," she said, addressing the shopkeeper. "I believe there were others here the night of the fire. Mrs. Morrison, wasn't it? And her grandchildren." Yes, Miss." Watson sounded uncomfortable. "They were here earlier. Matter of fact. Perhaps someone should ask them how the fire really started." Eleanor continued. "And who ran toward the flames instead of away?" "Eleanor," Samuel murmured. "Don't." But the door burst open, and Eleanor heard familiar footsteps, multiple sets, moving with purpose. "Is it true?" A woman's voice, elderly but strong, Mrs. Morrison. "Sally said she saw you both coming into town." "Gran, you shouldn't be out in this cold," Sally's young voice protested. "Hush, child. I'll go where I please." The footsteps came closer. "Mr. Hawthorne, Miss Whitfield." Eleanor felt the crowd's attention shift, crackling with curiosity. Mrs. Morrison had been a recluse since the fire, rarely venturing into town. "Ma'am," Samuel said quietly, "you don't need to—" "3 years," Mrs. Morrison interrupted. "3 years I've held my silence while this town painted you a monster. No more." She raised her voice, addressing the store. "You want to know about the fire? I'll tell you. My son-in-law knocked over a lantern. Drunk as usual. The flames spread to Mr. Hawthorne's mill next door. We were trapped, me, Sally, and little James." The store had gone dead silent. "This man," Mrs. Morrison continued, "broke down our door, carried James out first, then Sally, came back for me even as the beams were falling. The last thing he said before that beam caught him was, 'Get clear.' Not a thought for himself. Just us." "Gran saw it all," Sally added, her young voice fierce. "Saw him trapped under that burning beam. Saw his face. Saw what saving us cost him. And then we left town like cowards because Gran couldn't bear to see what her son-in-law's drinking had done to the man who saved us." Eleanor heard someone crying. A woman near the door. Others were murmuring. The tone different now. Uncertain. "But he's been living with this blind girl," someone protested. "Unmarried. It ain't proper." "Proper?" Mrs. Morrison's voice could have cut glass. "Was it proper when her uncle threw her into the street on a winter night? Was it proper when Mr. Blackwood here tried to buy her like cattle? This girl defended the man who saved my grandchildren when the rest of you were calling him monster. Far as I'm concerned, she's worth 10 of any of you." "Now see here," Blackwood started. "Shut your mouth. Harrison Blackwood." This was a new voice. Judge Carter, Eleanor realized with surprise. I've held my peace too long as well. Samuel Hawthorne was one of the finest men in this town before the fire. Built half your houses, employed a dozen men, never cheated anyone. One night of heroism shouldn't have erased all that. But they're living in sin, another voice protested. Are we? Eleanor spoke up, her voice carrying clearly. Samuel gave me my own room. He's been nothing but honorable. We work together, yes, keep house together, but there's been no impropriety. She paused. Though I wonder why you're all so concerned about propriety now, when you showed none throwing me out into the snow. The girl has a point, Watson said slowly. We all stood by while Cornelius cast out his blind niece. Where was our Christian charity then? The murmuring grew louder, voices arguing. Eleanor felt the tide turning, old assumptions being questioned. But she also felt Samuel's distress. He'd lived so long as an outcast. This sudden potential acceptance was overwhelming. Then Blackwood played his final card. Fine speeches, he said coldly. But it changes nothing. They're still living unmarried on that mountain. No decent person would... Then make it decent. The voice was Samuel's, rough with emotion. Eleanor felt him turn to her. Take her hands. Her heart began to race. Eleanor, he said, loud enough for all to hear. I've nothing to offer but a cabin on a mountain and hands scarred from honest work. But if you'll have me... He dropped to one knee. Eleanor gasped, her hands flying to her mouth. Marry me, Samuel continued. Not because they demand it, but because these weeks with you have been the brightest of my life. Because you see me clearer than anyone ever has. Because I want the right to call you wife. To protect you, to be your eyes and your partner for whatever years God grants us. The store held its breath. Eleanor felt tears streaming down her face, felt the weight of the moment. This wasn't how proposals were supposed to happen, not in a general store, not surrounded by people who'd scorned them both. But somehow, that made it perfect. Honest, real. I can be your eyes and protector, Samuel said softly. Just for her now. If you'll be my heart, my beauty, my reason to brave the world beyond our mountain. Eleanor sank down to face him, not caring about propriety or appearances. Her hands found his face, traced the scars she'd come to know so well. Yes, she whispered, then louder, for all to hear. Yes, Samuel Hawthorne, I'll marry you, today, if Judge Carter will perform the ceremony. Tomorrow, if he needs time, but yes, always yes. Someone started clapping, Sally Morrison, from the sound of it, then her grandmother joined in, then Watson, then others, not everyone. Eleanor could still feel hostile stares, hear muttered disapproval. But enough, more than enough. Samuel rose, pulling her up with him, and Eleanor felt herself enveloped in his strong arms. Around them, the crowd shifted, voices calling out both congratulations and continued condemnation. But in that moment, neither Samuel nor Eleanor cared. Judge Carter, Samuel called out, would you do us the honor? Son, the judge replied, and Eleanor heard both amusement and respect in his voice. I'd be proud to, this afternoon, if you like, my office, 3 o'clock. We'll stand witness. Mrs., Morrison declared, Sally and I both. As will I, Watson added, surprising everyone. About time this town remembered what real courage looks like. Blackwood stormed out, slamming the door behind him. Others followed, but more stayed, approaching cautiously. Eleanor felt hands touch hers, tentative, apologetic. Not everyone was ready to accept them, but the wall of isolation had cracked. Later, as they gathered their supplies, Samuel leaned close. Are you sure? This isn't how you dreamed of being proposed to? Eleanor smiled, turning her face up to his. I dreamed of being wanted, of being chosen, of someone seeing my worth despite my blindness. Because of it, he corrected, as he always did. Then this, she said, was better than any dream. That afternoon, in Judge Carter's small office, Samuel Hawthorne and Eleanor Whitfield were married. The ceremony was simple. No flowers, no music, no white dress. But Eleanor wore the carved bird in her hair, and Samuel's voice was steady as he promised to be her protector and partner. Mrs. Morrison cried. Sally held Eleanor's bouquet of winter herbs from the mountain. Watson and Judge Carter signed as witnesses. And when the judge pronounced them husband and wife, and Samuel kissed his bride with infinite tenderness, Eleanor knew that sometimes the most beautiful things came from the most broken beginnings. They returned to their mountain cabin as the sun set, painting the sky in colors Eleanor couldn't see but which Samuel described in loving detail. The town would talk, might always talk, but on their mountain, in their home, two scarred souls had found wholeness in each other. "Welcome home, Mrs. Hawthorne," Samuel said as he carried her over the threshold. Eleanor laughed, the sound bright as birdsong in the winter air. "I've been home since the day you found me in the storm. Now it's just official." That night, as snow began to fall again, they sat by their fire, no longer as reluctant host and unexpected guest, but as husband and wife. Samuel carved while Eleanor sang, their voices joining in harmony. And somewhere in town, Mrs. Morrison told anyone who'd listen about the wedding, about the man who'd saved her grandchildren finally finding happiness, about the blind woman who saw more clearly than those with perfect sight. Change would come slowly to redemption. Prejudice died hard in small towns, but a beginning had been made, a story rewritten. The scarred man and the blind woman had become simply Samuel and Eleanor Hawthorne. Proof that sometimes the most beautiful love stories were written by those the world had labeled broken. And in their cabin on the mountain, as Eleanor traced the scars on her husband's face, and he described the stars she couldn't see, they knew they'd found something worth more than acceptance, more than beauty, more than perfection. They'd found home.